When Sarah Collins found a bleeding stranger in her barn during Montana's worst blizzard of 1875, she thought she was just saving a life. She had no idea she was about to uncover a deadly conspiracy that killed her husband, or that this mysterious cowboy would become her family's salvation. With only 3 months to save her farm from foreclosure and two young children depending on her, Sarah's act of kindness sets off a chain of events that will test everything she believes about love, justice, and second chances. As dangerous men close in and shocking secrets emerge, Sarah must choose between the safety of silence and the courage to fight for the truth. But sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most unexpected rewards. Sometimes a wounded stranger becomes the answer to prayers you were afraid to pray. Will Sarah's choice to help a dying man cost her everything, or give her more than she ever dreamed possible? Don't miss this emotional journey of love, loss, and redemption. Like and subscribe for more heart-stopping stories that will restore your faith in the power of human kindness. You can't stay here. Wounded Stranger's Warning changes widow's life forever. The last letter from William trembled in Sarah Collins's hands as she stood before the crackling fireplace. 4 others had already been consumed by the flames, their secrets turning to ash and smoke that rose up the chimney like prayers she couldn't quite voice. The December wind howled against the cabin's weathered walls, matching the storm that raged in her heart. "Burn it," her practical mind whispered. "Let the dead rest." But her fingers tightened on the envelope, feeling the weight of her husband's final words. Written in his careful script during those last fevered nights when pneumonia had already begun its merciless claim on his lungs. She'd found them hidden in his toolbox 3 days ago, along with a warning that had turned her blood to ice. "Mama," Emma's voice drifted from the kitchen where she was helping Thomas with his letters by lamplight. At 10 years old, her daughter had already taken on responsibilities that should have belonged to a woman twice her age. "The stew's ready." Sarah tucked the letter into her apron pocket, its presence a constant reminder of the choice she couldn't make. Outside, the Montana winter pressed against their small homestead like a living thing, hungry and patient. 3 months. That's all the time Mr. Jenkins from the bank had given her. 3 months to find a miracle or watch everything William had built slip away like snow through her fingers. The cabin felt smaller tonight, its walls seeming to close in with each gust of wind. Thomas sat hunched over his slate, his young face serious as he traced letters with a piece of chalk worn down to a stub. At 8 years old, he carried himself with a gravity that broke her heart, the premature dignity of a boy trying to be the man of the house. "Look, Mama," he said, holding up his slate with pride. "I wrote Pa like you showed me." Sarah's throat tightened as she studied the careful letters. William would have been so proud. He'd always said education was the one thing no one could take away from their children, no matter how hard times became. "Beautiful work, darling," she managed, ruffling his dark hair. "Your father would be pleased." Emma ladled thin stew into 3 chipped bowls, the portions carefully measured to stretch their dwindling supplies. She'd learned, as they all had, to make every scrap count. The beef was mostly potatoes and turnips now, with just enough of meat to flavor the broth. But it was warm and it was theirs, and for tonight, that had to be enough. As they ate in companionable silence, Sarah's mind wandered to the letter burning a hole in her pocket. William's words seemed to whisper through the fabric Marcus Blackwood. "Poisoning the cattle. Evidence hidden in the old oak. Protect our family at all costs." The accusations were serious enough to destroy a man. Blackwood owned half the territory, his influence reaching from the courthouse to the church steps. But William had been thorough, methodical in his investigation. If he said Blackwood was poisoning livestock to drive out small farmers, then Sarah believed him. The question was, what to do with that belief? A sudden crash outside made them all freeze. Emma's spoon clattered against her bowl as she reached instinctively for Thomas's hand. The wind had been fierce all evening, but this sound was different, deliberate, heavy with purpose. "Stay here," Sarah commanded, reaching for William's rifle from its place above the mantel. Her hands shook as she checked the chambers, muscle memory from the early days of their marriage, when William had insisted she learn to protect herself. "Mama, don't," Thomas whispered, his eyes wide with the same fear that had haunted him since his father's death. The fear of being left alone. But Sarah was already moving toward the door, the rifle steady in her grip, despite the tremor in her voice. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me." The wind hit her like a physical blow, as she stepped onto the porch, driving snow into her face with stinging force. The world beyond their small circle of lamplight was a wall of white shapes shifting and dancing in the darkness. For a moment, she saw nothing but the storm. Then a horse whinnied low in pain somewhere near the barn. Sarah's heart hammered as she made her way across the yard, the snow already ankle-deep and growing deeper with each step. The barn door hung open, banging against its frame with each gust of wind. Inside, their three remaining cows huddled together for warmth, but it wasn't their distress she'd heard. A magnificent black stallion stood in the far stall, its sides heaving with exhaustion and pain. Foam flecked its muzzle and dark stains that looked suspiciously like blood marked its flanks. But it was the figure slumped against the horse's side that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. A man lay crumpled in the straw, unconscious and bleeding. His expensive coat was torn and muddy, his dark hair matted with what she hoped was melted snow. Even in the dim light, she could see the rise and fall of his chest, shallow but steady. Sarah approached carefully, the rifle still ready in her hands. Strangers in these parts usually meant trouble, especially ones who arrived in the middle of a blizzard with wounds that looked suspiciously like bullet holes. But as she knelt beside him checking for weapons, her nurse's instincts from the early days of the war began to take over. The man was burning with fever, his skin hot to the touch despite the cold. Blood seeped through his shirt from what appeared to be a graze along his ribs, and there was a nasty gash on his temple. Whoever he was, he'd been through hell to reach their barn. Her practical mind cataloged their supplies. Clean bandages were scarce, but she had them. Laudanum was nearly gone, but there was enough. Food was tight, but they could stretch it for a few days. The real question was whether helping a wounded stranger was worth the risk to her children. As if summoned by her thoughts, the barn door creaked open wider. Emma's face appeared in the gap, pale but determined. "Mama, we heard the horse." "I told you to stay inside," Sarah said firmly, but her daughter was already stepping into the barn, Thomas close behind her. "Is he dead?" Thomas whispered, edging closer with the morbid curiosity of childhood. "No, but he's badly hurt." Sarah made her decision, the same one she'd made 100 times during the war, when wounded soldiers had stumbled into their farmyard. "Emma, fetch my medical supplies. Thomas, help me get him inside." "But Mama," Emma protested, "we don't know who he is. What if he's dangerous?" Sarah looked down at the unconscious man, noting the quality of his clothes, the calluses on his hands that spoke of honest work despite his obvious wealth. His face, relaxed in unconsciousness, held none of the hardness she associated with outlaws or drifters. He looked like someone's son, someone's husband, someone who mattered to people somewhere. "Then we'll be careful," she said simply, "but we can't leave him to die in our barn. Your father wouldn't have, and neither will we." It took all three of them to half-carry, half-drag the stranger into the cabin. Sarah cleared the kitchen table with quick efficiency, spreading clean sheets over its scarred surface, while Emma boiled water and Thomas fed the fire until the room blazed with warmth. As Sarah cut away the man's shirt, she couldn't help but notice the other scars that marked his torso. Old wounds healed, but telling their own stories of violence survived. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to kill him. The thought should have worried her more than it did. "The bullet just grazed him," she murmured, more to herself than to her children. "Clean wound, praise the Lord. But the fever's the real danger now." She worked by lamplight, her hands steady despite the circumstances. Emma proved herself an able assistant, anticipating her mother's needs with the intuition of someone who'd helped tend the sick before. Thomas kept watch at the window, his young face serious with responsibility. The man stirred once as Sarah cleaned the head wound, muttering something about papers and promises, but his words were lost in delirium. She bathed his forehead with cool water, the way she'd learned during her brief time as a field nurse, and gradually his breathing began to ease. "Will he live?" Emma asked softly, helping her mother wrap clean bandages around the stranger's ribs. "God willing," Sarah replied, stepping back to survey their work. The man's color was already better, and his fever seemed to be breaking. "The next few hours will tell us for certain." As if on cue, the stranger's eyes fluttered open. They were a startling blue clear, despite the pain and confusion that clouded them. His gaze found Sarah's face and held it, and she felt something shift in the room, a sense of recognition that made no logical sense. "Where," he began, his voice rough as gravel. You're safe, Sarah said gently, offering him a cup of water. You're in our home. I'm Sarah Collins, and these are my children, Emma and Thomas. The man tried to sit up and immediately winced, his hand moving instinctively to his bandaged ribs. The horse is Midnight. Your horse is in the barn, Emma said quickly. He's hurt too, but not badly. Thomas gave him water and hay. Relief flickered across the stranger's features, followed quickly by wariness. His eyes swept the cabin, taking in the patched walls, the meager furnishings, the signs of a family struggling to survive. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, shamed of their poverty, in front of this obviously wealthy man. I don't have much to offer by way of payment, she began, but he cut her off with a slight shake of his head. You've already given me my life, he said simply. That's not a debt that can be repaid with money. Something in his tone made Sarah study his face more carefully. There was grief there, old and deep, and a loneliness that resonated with her own. This wasn't just a rich man who'd gotten himself shot. This was someone who understood loss. What's your name? She asked softly. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing what to tell them. James, he said finally. James Harrison. The name meant nothing to Sarah, but she saw Thomas's eyes widen with recognition. Her son was fascinated by tales of the big ranches, the cattle barons who controlled vast stretches of Montana territory. If Thomas knew the name, it meant their visitor was someone important. You should rest, Sarah said, noting the exhaustion that lined James's face. We can talk more when you're stronger. But as she began to turn away, his hand caught hers. His grip was weak but insistent, his blue eyes intense despite the pain medication beginning to take effect. Sarah, he said, and hearing her name on his lips sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Thank you for not turning me away. We don't turn away souls in need, she replied, echoing words her own mother had spoken years ago. That's not who we are. James's eyes drifted closed, but his hand remained in hers for another moment before finally releasing its hold. Sarah watched him sleep, noting the way the harsh lines of pain smoothed from his face, making him look younger, more vulnerable. Is he really James Harrison? Thomas whispered, awe evident in his voice. The one who owns the Double H Ranch. Hush, Sarah warned, but her mind was already racing. The Double H was legendary in these parts. Thousands of acres, the finest cattle in the territory, wealth beyond anything she could imagine. What was a man like that doing bleeding in her barn in the middle of a blizzard? And more importantly, what kind of enemies did someone that powerful have? The rest of the night passed in a blur of fever watches and whispered conversations. Sarah sent the children to bed, but found herself unable to sleep, sitting vigil beside their unexpected guest. Every few hours she checked his wounds, changed his bandages, spooned water between his lips when the fever spiked. It was during one of these quiet moments, with the wind still howling outside and the fire burning low in the grate, that James stirred again. His eyes opened clearer, this time more focused. How long? He asked. Since you arrived about 6 hours, Sarah replied, setting aside her mending. The fever broke an hour ago. You're going to be fine. He studied her face in the firelight, and she found herself acutely aware of her appearance. Her worn dress, her hair escaping its pins, the weariness that seemed permanently etched around her eyes. But there was no judgment in his gaze, only gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite name. Your children, he said. They're not afraid of me. Sarah smiled slightly. They've seen their share of wounded creatures. We've nursed injured animals back to health before. I suppose to them you're just another stray that wandered in from the storm. And you, James asked quietly, what do you see when you look at me? The question caught her off guard. Sarah found herself really looking at him for the first time since he'd awakened, noting the strength in his jaw, the intelligence in his eyes, the way his presence seemed to fill the small cabin with something she hadn't felt since William's death. Hope, maybe, or possibility. I see someone who's lost, she said honestly, someone who's been running from something for a long time. James was quiet for so long, she thought he'd fallen asleep again. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. My wife died 8 years ago, he said. Cancer. I built the Double H for her, but by the time it was finished, he trailed off, staring at the ceiling. I've been alone in that big house ever since, telling myself it was enough. That work was enough. Sarah felt her heart clench with recognition. Loneliness is its own kind of wound, she said softly, one that doesn't heal as easily as bullets. Your husband, pneumonia, 4 months ago. The words still felt strange on her tongue, too final to be real. He was everything to me. I don't know how to be without him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two wounded souls sharing the kind of honesty that only comes in the deep of night when defenses are down and pain speaks to pain. The children seem to be managing well, James observed eventually. Sarah's laugh held no humor. They're putting on a brave face. Thomas has nightmares about losing me too. Emma's trying so hard to be the little mother that she's forgotten how to be a child. And she stopped, surprised by her own openness. And you're drowning, James finished gently. Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes. She hadn't admitted it out loud even to herself, but that's exactly how she felt. Like she was drowning in responsibility and grief and fears, trying desperately to keep her head above water for her children's sake. The bank wants to foreclose, she heard herself say. 3 months. That's all the time I have left. James was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice held a new quality, something harder, more determined. What if I told you there might be another way? Sarah looked up sharply. What do you mean? But before James could answer, the sound of approaching horses cut through the night air. Multiple riders moving fast despite the snow. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the purposeful rhythm of their approach. James was already trying to sit up, his face grim, despite his obvious pain. How many windows in this cabin? 3. Why, James, what's happening? People who want me dead, he said grimly, reaching for his clothes with obvious effort. And they've found me. The horses were closer now, their hoofbeats drumming against the frozen ground like thunder. Sarah could see torches through the window, orange flames dancing in the darkness like malevolent stars. Take the children and get to the root cellar, James ordered, struggling to his feet. Whatever happens, don't come out until I tell you it's safe. But Sarah was already moving toward the gun cabinet, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. She'd protected this home once before when William was away on business. She could do it again. This is my house, she said firmly, checking the rifle's chambers. My children, if you want our help, then we face this together. James stared at her for a moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or respect. Can you shoot? He asked. Well enough. A grim smile touched his lips. Then welcome to the fight, Sarah Collins. I hope you don't regret it. Outside, the riders were drawing closer, their shouts beginning to cut through the wind. Sarah woke the children quickly, ushering them to the root cellar with calm efficiency. Emma's eyes were wide but determined, while Thomas clutched his father's old hunting knife with white knuckles. Stay down, Sarah instructed, kissing each of them quickly. No matter what you hear, don't come out. As she returned to the main room, she found James at the window, his face pale but alert. Despite his injuries, he moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to danger. 6 men, he reported, maybe 7. They're spreading out to surround us. Who are they? Men who work for Marcus Blackwood, James said grimly, though he'll deny any knowledge of this if we don't survive to tell the tale. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the letter in her apron pocket. Marcus Blackwood. The same name William had written in his careful script, surrounded by accusations and evidence and warnings. It couldn't be a coincidence. James, she said carefully, what do you know about cattle poisoning? He turned to look at her sharply, his blue eyes tense in the firelight. What did you just say? But before Sarah could answer, a voice called out from the darkness beyond their door. Cold, confident, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. James Harrison. We know you're in there. Come out peacefully, and the woman and children won't be harmed. James's jaw tightened. Liar, he muttered under his breath. Then louder. Go to hell, Bradford. A gunshot shattered the night, the bullet splintering the wood beside the window. Sarah ducked instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs. You always were stubborn, the voice called back. But you're outnumbered and wounded. This doesn't have to end badly for everyone. Sarah found herself moving closer to James, drawn by some instinct she didn't fully understand. In the lamplight, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped his weapon with practiced ease. This wasn't the first time he'd faced men like these, but something told her it might be the last. "There's something you need to know," she said urgently, pulling the letter from her pocket. "About Blackwood, about why William died." James's eyes widened as he saw the envelope, recognizing something in William's careful handwriting. "Your husband was investigating Blackwood. More than that," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the danger surrounding them. "He found proof, evidence that could destroy Blackwood's empire. And now they know I have it." Understanding dawned in James's eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like admiration. "You brave, foolish woman," he breathed. "You've been sitting on a powder keg this whole time." Another gunshot closer this time. The men outside were growing impatient, their circle tightening like a noose around the little cabin. "What do we do?" Sarah asked. James looked at her for a long moment, this woman who'd saved his life and now stood ready to fight beside him. In her eyes, he saw the same fierce determination that had kept her family alive through the worst winter in memory, the same strength that had driven her to nurse a stranger back to health despite having barely enough for her own children. "We survive," he said simply, "and then we make Blackwood pay for every drop of innocent blood he spilled." Sarah nodded, feeling something settle into place in her chest. Fear was still there, cold and sharp, but it was tempered now by purpose, by the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore. Outside, the men were moving closer, but inside the little cabin, two wounded souls had found something worth fighting for: each other. The children sleeping in the root cellar, the truth that could set them all free. The night was far from over, but for the first time since William's death, Sarah Collins felt ready to face whatever came next. The storm was about to begin in earnest. The first bullet shattered the front window, sending glass cascading across the wooden floor like deadly snow. Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside James, her heart hammering, as shouts erupted from the darkness outside. "Last chance, Harrison." Bradford's voice cut through the night. "We just want the woman's papers. Nobody has to die tonight." James's grip tightened on his rifle. "They know about William's evidence," he said grimly. "This was never just about me." Sarah's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. "You weren't just passing through, were you? You came here looking for something." Before James could answer, another volley of gunfire erupted. The men outside were firing systematically now, trying to flush them out through fear and intimidation. A bullet splintered the door frame inches from Sarah's head, and she could hear Emma's muffled cry from the root cellar below. "Stay down," she called to her children, then turned back to James. "There's a back way out, through the pantry, if we can reach the barn." "No," James's voice was firm. "They'll have men positioned there too. Our best chance is to make them come to us." Sarah studied his face in the flickering lamplight. There was something he wasn't telling her. She could see it in the tension around his eyes. "James, what aren't you saying?" He was quiet for a moment, weighing something in his mind. Then with obvious reluctance, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather journal. Even in the dim light, Sarah could see it was filled with careful notations, maps, dates. "Your husband didn't just find evidence about the cattle poisoning," James said quietly. "He hired me to investigate Blackwood's entire operation. We'd been corresponding for months before he died." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You knew William?" "Never met him face to face, but yes, he was a good man, Sarah. Thorough, brave, and absolutely convinced that Blackwood was systematically destroying small farms to acquire land cheaply." James's voice grew heavy with regret. "I was supposed to meet him the week he died. If I'd gotten here sooner." "You think Blackwood killed my husband?" It wasn't a question, and James didn't treat it like one. "Pneumonia is convenient, hard to prove it wasn't natural, but the timing—" He shook his head. William was getting too close to something big. Something that could have brought down Blackwood's entire empire. Another burst of gunfire, and this time Sarah heard the distinctive sound of splintering wood from the direction of the barn. They were trying to flush out any escape routes, boxing them in like animals. "What was William so close to finding?" she asked, reloading her rifle with practiced efficiency. James consulted his journal quickly. "Financial records. Proof that Blackwood's been using his political connections to acquire mineral rights illegally, then poisoning the water supply to force farmers off land that contains silver deposits. Your husband found a pattern. Every farm Blackwood acquired had an accidental contamination incident within 6 months of purchase." Sarah's breath caught. The Henderson place, the Martins. They all had sick cattle before they sold to Blackwood. Exactly. And your farm sits on what William believed could be the richest silver vein in the territory. The implications were staggering. Sarah looked around their humble cabin with new eyes, seeing not just the home William had built with his own hands, but the potential fortune that lay beneath their feet. Fortune that men like Blackwood would kill for. Harrison Bradford's voice again closer now. We're coming in. Send out the woman and children, and maybe you'll live to see morning. James moved to the broken window, rifle ready. Over my dead body, Bradford. That can be arranged. The attack came from 3 directions at once. Men burst through the front door while others tried to force their way through the back. Sarah found herself moving on pure instinct, firing through the kitchen window at muzzle flashes in the darkness. Beside her, James worked with deadly efficiency, his shots precise despite his injuries. The confined space worked in their favor. The attackers couldn't use their numbers effectively, and Sarah's knowledge of every corner and hiding place in her own home gave them a crucial advantage. But it couldn't last forever. We need to get to the children, Sarah gasped during a brief lull in the fighting. Agreed, but first, James tossed his journal to her. If something happens to me that contains everything William and I discovered, get it to the territorial marshal in Helena. Judge Crawford can be trusted. Sarah caught the journal, understanding the weight of what he was giving her. Nothing's going to happen to you. James smiled grimly. You can't promise that, but you can promise to finish what your husband started. Before Sarah could respond, a new sound cut through the gunfire, the thunder of approaching horses. Many horses moving fast. Bradford's men heard it too, their firing becoming more erratic as uncertainty crept into their ranks. What the hell? Someone shouted from outside. The new arrivals announced themselves with a volley of gunfire that sent Bradford's men scrambling for cover. Through the broken window, Sarah could see riders pouring into their yards surrounding the attackers, who moments before had held all the advantages. Double H riders, James called out, relief evident in his voice. My men! The tide of battle turned with brutal swiftness. Caught between the cabin's defenders and the newly arrived ranch hands, Bradford's men found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered. Some tried to fight, others to flee. Within minutes, the shooting had stopped entirely. Sarah sagged against the wall, adrenaline still coursing through her veins, as silence descended over the homestead. Through the damaged windows, she could hear men calling to each other, the sound of horses. The efficient bustle of a fight concluded. Mrs. Collins, a new voice called from outside. This is Tom Mackenzie, foreman of the Double H. Are you and the children all right? We're fine, Sarah called back, then hurried to the root cellar. Emma Thomas, it's safe now. Her children emerged pale but unhurt, throwing themselves into her arms with fierce intensity. Over their heads, she watched James speak quietly with a grizzled man who could only be Mackenzie. How did you know to come? James was asking. Got word from town that Bradford and his boys were riding hard toward the Collins place, Mackenzie replied. Figured you might need some help, seeing as how you were supposed to check in yesterday and never did. James nodded, then gestured towards Sarah and the children. Tom, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Sarah Collins and her children Emma and Thomas. They saved my life. Mackenzie tipped his hat respectfully. Ma'am, honored to make your acquaintance. His eyes took in the bullet holes, the broken glass, the signs of the battle they just fought. Looks like you gave as good as you got. Mrs. Collins is quite a remarkable woman, James said, and something in his tone made Sarah look up sharply. There was admiration there, yes, but also something deeper. Something that made her pulse quicken, despite the danger they'd just survived. What about Bradford? Sarah asked. Did you capture him? Mackenzie's expression darkened. Got away, I'm afraid. Lost 2 men, but the rest scattered like rabbits. They'll think twice before coming back here, though. But Sarah wasn't reassured. Men like Bradford didn't give up easily, especially when there was this much money at stake. And now that Blackwood knew she had William's evidence, her family would never be safe. As if reading her thoughts, James approached her quietly while Mackenzie organized the cleanup. You can't stay here, he said simply. Not now that they know what you have. This is our home, Sarah replied, but even as she said it, she could see the truth in his words. The cabin felt violated now, its sanctuary broken by violence. Emma was clinging to her skirts and Thomas kept looking toward the door as if expecting more attackers to burst through. I know, James said gently. but sometimes tactical retreat is the only way to survive a war. Where would we go? We have no money, no family. You have me. In the simple statement, Oshkosh hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them was quite ready to examine. Sarah found herself studying James's face, looking for the catch, the angle, the reason he would burden himself with a widow and her children. Why, wow, she asked finally. You don't owe us anything more than you've already given. James was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes serious in the lamplight. Do you believe in providence, Sarah? The question surprised her. Yes, I suppose I do. Then maybe you'll understand when I say that being shot and stumbling into your barn wasn't an accident. Maybe it was meant to happen. Maybe we were meant to find each other. Before Sarah could respond, Emma tugged at her sleeve. Mom, are we going to live at Mr. Harrison's ranch? The innocent question from her daughter crystallized the moment, making the abstract suddenly concrete. Sarah looked around their damaged cabin, then at James, then at her children's upturned faces. Would you like that? She asked them. Thomas nodded eagerly. Could I learn about cattle and horse? I'm sure that could be arranged, James said with a smile that transformed his entire face. The Double H is big enough for all of us. What about school? Emma asked practically. There's a schoolhouse in town, and I have a housekeeper who's been after me for years to get some life into that big empty house. Sarah felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. Safety for her children, education, a chance to heal from the wounds of the past months. But even as relief flooded through her, worry niggled at the edges of her mind. James, she said carefully, what you're offering, it's generous beyond words, but I won't be anyone's charity case. His expression grew serious. What if I told you it wasn't charity? What if I told you I needed you as much as you need me? How? James glanced toward Mackenzie, who was supervising the boarding up of the broken windows, then back to Sarah. Come with me to the Double H and I'll show you. But, Sarah, his voice grew urgent. Whatever you decide, decide quickly. Bradford will be back, probably with more men. We need to be gone before dawn. Sarah looked around the cabin one more time, seeing it with different eyes now. The home William had built with such love and hope. The place where they'd been happy, where her children had taken their first steps, spoken their first words. Leaving felt like abandoning him all over again. But staying meant risking everything he'd died to protect. 1 hour, she said finally. We'll need an hour to pack what we can carry. James nodded. Mackenzie will help you. I'll send word ahead to prepare rooms at the house. As the men began organizing the move, Sarah found herself alone with her children for a moment. They sat, huddled together on William's old chair, their young faces serious with the weight of change. Are you scared? She asked them quietly. A little, Emma admitted, but Mr. Harrison seems nice, and he protected us. He's not Papa, Thomas said, and Sarah heard the echo of her own fears in his words. No, she agreed, he's not Papa, and he never will be. Papa will always be Papa no matter where we live or who we meet. But sometimes, she struggled for the right words. Sometimes people come into our lives when we need them most, and maybe we come into theirs when they need us too. Like providence, Mama asked, remembering James's word. Like providence, Sarah confirmed. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Sarah packed their few precious belongings, William's Bible, her mother's china, the children's favorite books. Everything else would have to be left behind, but these items held memories that made a house a home. As she wrapped William's photograph in her wedding dress, she found herself thinking about the letter still tucked in her apron pocket. The evidence that had cost her husband his life and nearly cost her and the children theirs. It represented justice but also danger, power but also responsibility. Ready? James appeared in the doorway, while his own few possessions gathered in a small bag. Sarah looked around the cabin one last time, then nodded. Ready. The ride to the Double H took 3 hours through snow-covered hills and frozen streams. Sarah rode beside James while Emma and Thomas shared a gentle mare under Mackenzie's watchful eye. The moon had broken through the clouds, turning the landscape into a silver wonderland that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Tell me about your ranch, Sarah said as they crested a hill and began to descend into a broad valley. It's quiet, James said with a self-deprecating laugh. Too quiet most of the time. I built it for a family. I never had rooms that echo with emptiness. Mrs. Henderson does her best to keep it livable, but a house needs more than just cleaning to make it a home. How big is it? The house 12 rooms. The land about 20,000 acres, give or take. Sarah tried to imagine such vastness and failed. Their entire homestead would have been lost in a corner of James's property. You must feel like a king in his castle. More like a ghost in a mausoleum, James replied quietly. Until now. They rode in comfortable silence after that, but Sarah found herself stealing glances at the man beside her. In profile, with the moonlight highlighting the strong lines of his jaw and the determined set of his shoulders, he looked like something from one of Emma's fairy tale books. The Wounded Knight, perhaps, or the prince who'd lost his way. But there was nothing fairy tale about the danger they'd just escaped or the evidence burning a hole in her pocket. Real life was messier than stories with no guarantee of happy endings. The Double H revealed itself gradually as they approached. First the outlying buildings, then the corrals and barns, and finally the house itself. Sarah's breath caught as she saw it clearly for the first time. It was enormous, a sprawling two-story structure with wide porches and tall windows that gleamed like golden eyes in the darkness. "It's beautiful," Emma breathed from her position on the mare. "It's huge," Thomas added, his voice filled with awe. James dismounted and helped Sarah down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Welcome to the Double H," he said quietly, "for however long you'll have it." Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, proved to be a cheerful woman in her 50s who fussed over the children and insisted on preparing a proper meal despite the late hour. As Sarah followed her through room after room of elegant furniture and fine appointments, she felt increasingly out of place. "Don't let all the fancy things intimidate you," Mrs. Henderson said kindly, noticing Sarah's discomfort. "Mr. Harrison's been rattling around in this place like a dried pea in a gourd. It needs the sound of children's laughter, if you ask me." The rooms prepared for them were larger than their entire cabin had been. Emma and Thomas would share a space with twin beds and a window seat overlooking the valley, while Sarah's room adjoined theirs with a connecting door. "Mr. Harrison's room is down the hall," Mrs. Henderson explained with studied casualness. "Far enough to be proper, close enough to be convenient if you need anything in the night." After the children were settled and sleeping, Sarah found herself alone in her room, still wearing her travel-stained dress and trying to process the enormity of the day's events. This morning, she'd been a struggling widow facing foreclosure. Tonight, she was a guest in a mansion holder of secrets that could topple an empire. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Sarah, it's James. Could we talk?" She opened the door to find him still dressed, but looking as exhausted as she felt. "Of course. Would you like to come in, or?" "The study might be better. There are things I need to show you, and the children shouldn't overhear." Sarah followed him down a hallway lined with oil paintings and into a room that was clearly James's sanctuary. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and a massive desk dominated the space. But it was the large map spread across the desk's surface that drew her attention. "This is Blackwood's empire," James explained, pointing to areas marked in red. "Every property he's acquired in the past 5 years, every mineral claim, every water right." He traced a pattern with his finger. "And this is the route of the proposed railroad spur that will connect this region to the main line." Sarah studied the map, beginning to see the connections. The farms he's acquired all lie along the railroad route. "Exactly, but it's more than that." James pulled out a folder thick with documents. "These are assay reports for mineral surveys conducted secretly on lands Blackwood now owns." "Sarah, we're not just talking about silver. There's copper, maybe even gold. Enough to make him one of the richest men in America. And my farm," James pointed to a small square on the map marked with William's name. "Right in the center of it all, the Keystone property. Without it, Blackwood can't consolidate his holdings or negotiate favorable terms with the railroad." Sarah sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what William had uncovered. "No wonder they killed him. We don't know for certain." "Yes, we do," Sarah interrupted. "In our hearts we know, just like we know they'll never stop trying to get what they want." James was quiet for a moment, then moved to a cabinet and withdrew a bottle of whiskey. He poured 2 glasses, offering one to Sarah. "Then we make sure they don't get it." "How?" "By finishing what William started. By gathering enough evidence to bring Blackwood down completely." James raised his glass. "And by making sure his victims get justice." Sarah lifted her own glass, feeling the weight of the commitment she was making. To William, and to justice. They drank, and Sarah felt the whiskey burn warmth into her chest. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the Double H in pristine white. But inside the study, two people who had found each other in the darkness began to plan how they would bring light to the shadows where evil thrived. It wouldn't be easy, it might not even be possible. But for the first time since William's death, Sarah Collins felt like she had a purpose beyond mere survival. She had a mission, and she wasn't facing it alone. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight as they worked, spreading documents across the desk, comparing notes, building the case that would either save them all or destroy them completely. The real fight was just beginning. 2 weeks at the Double H had transformed Sarah's children in ways she hadn't thought possible. Thomas rode with the confidence of a boy born to the saddle, and Emma had taken to helping Mrs. Henderson manage the household accounts with an aptitude that made James smile. But it was the quiet moments that revealed the deepest changes. The way Thomas no longer startled at sudden sounds, how Emma's laughter had returned bright and genuine. Sarah stood at the study window, watching her children play in the snow-covered yard, their voices carrying on the crisp morning air. Behind her, James worked at his desk, organizing the evidence they'd spent days compiling. The case against Blackwood was growing stronger, but so was the danger. Bradford was seen in town yesterday, James said without looking up from his papers. He's not giving up. None of them are, Sarah replied, touching the letter in her pocket, William's final gift that had become both their salvation and their curse. Mrs. Henderson mentioned strange riders asking questions at the mercantile. James set down his pen and joined her at the window. In the 2 weeks since their arrival, they'd fallen into an easy partnership, working side by side, sharing meals, caring for the children together. It felt natural in a way that should have troubled Sarah more than it did. There's something else, James said quietly. Something I haven't told you about why I really came to your farm that night. Sarah turned to face him, noting the tension in his shoulders. What do you mean? I wasn't just investigating Blackwood for William. I was investigating him for myself. James moved to his desk and withdrew a yellowed newspaper clipping. My father, David Harrison, died 5 years ago. Officially, it was a riding accident, but I never believed it. Sarah took the clipping, scanning the brief article about a respected rancher found dead near a canyon on his property. You think Blackwood killed your father? I know he did. My father discovered that Blackwood was falsifying mineral surveys, bribing territorial officials. He was going to expose everything. James's jaw tightened. 3 days before he was supposed to testify before a federal marshal, he had his accident. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. So when William contacted you, it felt like providence, a chance to finally get justice for my father and to prevent other families from suffering what mine did. James met her eyes. I should have told you sooner. You deserve to know that my interest in this case is personal. Sarah studied his face, seeing the pain he'd carried for 5 years. We're all fighting our own ghosts, James. At least now we're fighting them together. Before James could respond, Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her face pale with worry. Mr. Harrison, there's a man here to see you. Says he's from the territorial marshal's office. Sarah and James exchanged glances. They'd sent word to Judge Crawford about their evidence, but hadn't expected a response so soon. The man waiting in the parlor was tall and weathered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He introduced himself as Deputy Marshal Tom Bennett and got straight to business. Judge Crawford sent me to collect your evidence against Marcus Blackwood, Bennett said, settling into a chair. He's concerned about your safety and wants to move quickly. James hesitated. How do we know you're who you say you are? Bennett smiled grimly and withdrew an official badge and letter of introduction. Smart question. Blackwood has people everywhere. He studied the documents James provided, then looked up with interest. This is impressive work. Between what you've gathered and what we've been developing independently, we might finally have enough to bring him down. Independently, Sarah asked. There's been a federal investigation into territorial corruption for months. Your evidence fills in crucial gaps. Bennett's expression grew serious. But I have to warn you, Blackwood knows we're closing in. Our sources say he's planning something desperate. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air. Many horses moving fast. James was at the window in an instant, his face grim. 20 men, maybe more, he reported, armed and moving to surround the house. Bennett drew his weapon with practiced ease. Looks like Blackwood decided to take matters into his own hands. The next few minutes passed in controlled chaos. James sent word to his ranch hands while Sarah gathered the children, moving them to the safest room in the house. Mrs. Henderson proved surprisingly capable, with a rifle taking position at an upstairs window, with the calm efficiency of someone who'd faced trouble before. Sarah, James caught her arm as she prepared to take her own position. If this goes badly, if something happens to me, take the children and go with Bennett. Promise me. One thing's going to happen to you, she said firmly. But even as she spoke, she could see the odds they faced through the window. Blackwood had brought a small army. Promise me, James insisted. Sarah met his eyes, seeing in them something that made her breath catch. Not just determination or resolve, but something deeper. Something that spoke of feelings neither of them had been ready to acknowledge. I promise, she whispered. But James, when this is over, we need to talk. A slight smile touched his lips. I'd like that very much. The attack began with Marcus Blackwood's voice, cultured and reasonable, carrying across the snow-covered yard like a snake's whisper. Harrison, I know you're in there. Send out Mrs. Collins and her children, and we can settle this like civilized men. James appeared at the front window, rifle ready. The only thing we're settling today is your debt to Justice Blackwood. Justice Blackwood's laugh was cold. You want to talk about justice? You've been living in a house built on lies, Harrison. Did you ever wonder how your father really acquired the land for the double H? Sarah saw James stiffen beside her. What are you talking about? Ask him about the Martinez family, Harrison. Ask him what happened to the homesteaders who lived here before your father claimed this land. You're lying, James called back, but Sarah could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. Am I? Check your father's papers if you dare. Some truths are harder to face than others. Bennett moved closer to James. Don't let him get in your head. It's an old tactic. Sow doubt to weaken resolve. But Sarah could see that Blackwood's words had found their mark. James's face was pale, his grip on his rifle less steady than before. Whatever secret Blackwood was hinting at it had the power to shake James to his core. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. While Blackwood kept up his psychological assault from the front, his men moved on the barn and the back of the house. Sarah found herself firing through a kitchen window, her shots methodical and precise. The battle was fiercer than the one at her cabin. These men were better armed, better organized, and they had the advantage of numbers. But the Double H had been built with defense in mind: thick walls, strategic windows, and multiple escape routes. They're trying to fire the barn, Mrs. Henderson called from upstairs. Sarah's heart clenched as she thought of the horses trapped inside, including Midnight James's stallion. Without thinking, she moved toward the back door. Where are you going? James demanded. The horses can't defend themselves, she replied, checking her ammunition. Sarah, no, it's too dangerous. But she was already moving, slipping out through the kitchen door while the attackers were focused on the front of the house. The barn was only 50 yards away, but it felt like miles as bullets whined past her head. She reached the barn to find smoke beginning to seep through the walls. The horses were panicking, their whinnies high and desperate. Working quickly, Sarah opened stall doors, driving the animals toward the far exit that led to the protected pasture behind the hill. It was as she led the last horse, a gentle mare Emma had been learning to ride, that she came face to face with the man who'd been trying to set the fire. Bradford turned from his work with the torch, his scarred face splitting in a cruel grin. Well, well, the grieving widow. You should have burned with your cabin. Sarah raised her rifle, but Bradford was faster, knocking it from her hands with the flaming torch. The weapon clattered across the barn floor as fire began to catch in the hay. Blackwood wants you alive, Bradford said, advancing on her. But accidents happen in fires. Real shame that. Sarah backed away, her mind racing. The barn was filling with smoke, and she could hear the crackle of flames growing stronger. In moments, the whole structure would be ablaze. My husband found the truth, she said, playing for time. Others know it too. Killing me won't change anything. Maybe not, Bradford agreed, but it'll make me feel better. He lunged at her, the torch swinging in a deadly arc. Sarah ducked, grabbing a pitchfork from the wall. The 2 weapons clashed in a shower of sparks as they fought among the stalls, smoke growing thicker with each passing second. Bradford was stronger, but Sarah was fighting for her children's future. When he overextended on a thrust, she reversed her grip and drove the pitchfork's handle into his solar plexus. He doubled over, gasping, and she brought the weapon down on his head with all her strength. Bradford collapsed unconscious but breathing. Sarah grabbed his torch and ran for the door, bursting into the clean air just as the barn roof began to catch fire. "Sarah!" James's voice was raw with relief as she stumbled toward the house. He met her halfway, pulling her into his arms with desperate intensity. "I thought I'd lost you." For a moment, they held each other in the snow-covered yard while gunfire echoed around them. Sarah felt something shift between them, a recognition of how precious this partnership had become, how much they had to lose. "The horses are safe," she managed, "but Bradford is no longer our problem." James finished, helping her back to the house. "Bennett's men arrived 5 minutes ago. The tides turned." Indeed, the federal reinforcements had changed everything. Caught between the house's defenders and Bennett's deputies, Blackwood's men were surrendering or fleeing. Through the smoke of the burning barn, Sarah could see the man himself, hands raised, his face a mask of cold fury. "It's over," James said softly, and Sarah heard wonder in his voice. "It's actually over." The aftermath stretched into evening. Statements were taken, prisoners were transported, and evidence was cataloged. Bennett assured them that Blackwood would face federal charges for murder, conspiracy, and a dozen other crimes. "What about his claims about your father?" Sarah asked James as they stood on the porch watching the last of the marshal's wagons disappear into the dusk. James was quiet for a long moment. "I found the papers he mentioned in my father's safe, hidden behind other documents." Sarah waited, letting him find the words at his own pace. "The Martinez family did live here first, homesteaders like you and William. They had children." James's voice was barely above a whisper. "My father bought the land from Blackwood after the family died. Officially, it was influenza. But the timing, the circumstances... You think Blackwood killed them too?" "I know he did. And my father knew it when he bought the land. He justified it by saying it was already done, that at least the land would be put to good use." James turned to face her pain, clear in his eyes. "I've been living on a foundation of murder, Sarah. Just like Blackwood." Sarah reached for his hand, gripping it firmly. "No, not like Blackwood. Your father made a terrible compromise, yes. But you've spent the last 5 years trying to make it right. You've used this land to build something good, something that honors life instead of destroying it. The children would still be alive if my father had said no. Maybe, or maybe Blackwood would have found another buyer and another way to cover his crimes. You can't change the past, James. But you can choose what to do with the future." They stood in comfortable silence, watching stars appear in the clear sky. The burned barn was a black skeleton against the snow, but it could be rebuilt. Everything could be rebuilt, given time and love, and the determination to create something better from the ashes. "Sarah," James said eventually, "what I said in the house about needing to talk." "I know." Sarah turned to face him fully, seeing in his eyes the same hope and fear that filled her own heart. "I feel it too. Whatever this is between us. It's not just gratitude or convenience," James said carefully. "What I feel for you, it's real. But I won't pressure you. I know you're still grieving, William still finding your way." Sarah thought of her husband, of the love they'd shared, and the family they'd built together. William would always be a part of her, but she was beginning to understand that the heart could expand to hold new love without diminishing what came before. "I'll always love William," she said softly. "He gave me my children, taught me what it meant to be part of a family. But James," she reached up to touch his face, "you gave me back my future. You and the children, we fit together, like we were meant to find each other." James closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "I've been alone so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to hope for more than just surviving each day." "Then let's stop just surviving," Sarah said. "Let's start living." When James kissed her, it was gentle and tentative, a question more than a declaration. Sarah answered by deepening the kiss, letting herself feel the warmth and possibility that had been growing between them for weeks. They broke apart as the front door opened, and Emma and Thomas appeared, having been released from their safe room now that the danger was past. "Are the bad men really gone?" Thomas asked, staying close to Sarah's side. "Really gone," James confirmed, kneeling to the boy's level. "And they won't be coming back. Good, Emma said with fierce satisfaction. I didn't like them at all. She looked between Sarah and James, taking in their proximity with the sharp eyes of a 10-year-old. Are you going to get married? Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but James just laughed. Would you like that? Yes, both children said simultaneously, and Sarah saw the hope in their faces that she'd been too afraid to acknowledge in her own heart. Then I suppose I'd better ask your mother properly, James said, standing and taking Sarah's hands in his. Sarah Collins, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not because it's convenient or safe, but because I love you and can't imagine my life without you and your children in it? Sarah looked at this man who'd stumbled wounded into her barn and changed everything, who'd taught her children to hope again, who'd helped her find strength she didn't know she possessed, who'd shown her that love could bloom even in the darkest soil. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. The children cheered and Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway with tears in her eyes and a bottle of champagne she'd been saving for a special occasion. As they celebrated on the porch of the Double H, with the ashes of the old barn smoking in the distance and the promise of spring in the air, Sarah thought about providence and second chances, about how sometimes the worst storms brought unexpected gifts. She thought about William and knew in her heart that he would approve. He'd always wanted his family to be happy, to be safe, to have every opportunity to flourish. What should we name the new ranch? James asked as they watched the children play in the snow, their laughter echoing across the valley. Sarah smiled, thinking of morning glories and new beginnings of love that bloomed fresh each day, despite the harsh winters that might come. The Morning Star Ranch, she said, for new light after the darkest nights. James squeezed her hand. Perfect. Like everything else about this unexpected family we've made. As the stars wheeled overhead and the children's laughter filled the air, Sarah Collins, soon to be Sarah Harrison, felt truly wealthy for the first time in her life. Not in gold or silver or vast acres of land, but in the riches that really mattered. Love, family, hope for tomorrow, and the deep abiding knowledge that some wounds, when they heal, leave you stronger than you were before. The winter was ending, spring was coming, and they would face it together.